Hello, I'm John. Welcome back to Must Read More. Today I'm going to share with you the books I've been reading over the past 2 weeks. There are 8 of them. So the first one I read was a collection, Daphne du Maurier's Classics of the Macabre, illustrated by Foreman. And as you can see, there are the birds, and there is the red-hooded figure from Don't Look Now. I think there are 6 stories in this, and it's illustrated throughout. See, there are the birds. And let's see if I can find some pictures here. Here's the birds. Some of them are full-page illustrations, and some of them are just kind of small. And these were not my favorite stories. Not of du Maurier's. This is, I think, the only collection of du Maurier's stories I've ever read. I've read Don't Look Now before, and I've probably read a couple more of her short stories. This is the blue lenses. A lady has eye surgery where they put some, I'm not exactly sure of what the surgery was, but they put some blue lenses on her eyes, and so she wakes up, they take the bandages off, and she sees all the nurses and doctors and everyone as animals, and she thinks there's some kind of conspiracy against her to drive her crazy, and so her husband can steal her money or something. And my favorite in this was The Apple Tree. It's about a man whose wife dies, and he never paid any attention to her and barely noticed she existed, and she dies, and then one day as he's shaving, he looks out into the yard, and there's an apple tree, and it reminds him of her, and he just starts to hate this apple tree, and it was just my favorite story in the collection. After that, I read Agatha Christie's The Mysterious Affair at Styles. I think this is Agatha Christie's first novel. It's the first Hercule Poirot novel. And it uses quite a few of the plot lines that Christie would use throughout her writing career. There's a murder at the big house, and of course the murdered person is the one who owns the big house, and there's a will, and there are some kind of, suspicious relatives and suspicious people in the house. Hercule Poirot comes in to figure out who the murderer is and help keep these people from having a big scandal, and nobody wants to help solve the murder, nobody wants to talk to anybody, and they all get in the way of solving the murder, and they all snipe at each other, and they don't get along, and you wonder why they have anything to do with each other at all. And of course the answer is money, entirely money. The murdered woman was the stepmother of 2 of the guys in this. She owned the house, she had all the money, but she raised them from when they were young. And then she suddenly gets married to a guy that nobody likes. Nobody understands why she married him. And the kind of irritating thing about this novel was that Christie really didn't give us any insight into why the characters felt or acted the way they did. We're not told why she married this guy or what they saw in each other or anything like that. And there are twists and turns. It was hard to keep track of the characters because I felt like the characters weren't that well defined, and there were so many of them that I kept losing track of who was who. I think Christie's best work was probably in the 30s and 40s. This was in 1921. I think this was her first novel, so she was still kind of ironing out her process. It was all right. After that, I'd been reading so many books written by British authors set in Britain that I felt like I needed to read a distinctively American voice. So I read Yondering by Louis L'Amour. I'm not sure if you can see, there's Louis L'Amour there. And despite there being cowboy boots, this is not actually a collection of Western stories at all. These are mostly set in port cities and on freighters. When L'Amour was young, he worked for a time on freighters. He traveled around the world on a freighter, moving cargo from place to place. Some of these take place in Singapore, not Singapore, but Shanghai. And they're about just kind of the different characters he ran into and the different situations he found himself in. At the time, it wasn't unusual for sailors to wind up in a strange port without much money and nowhere to go for months at a time. It was okay. I like Louis L'Amour's short fiction better than I like his novels. And I like his short fiction about hopping trains and bush planes in Alaska and adventures in Asia and the islands much better than I like his westerns. It's nothing personal against L'Amour. I'm not really a big fan of westerns. I read them every now and then. I read a couple for June on the Range earlier this year, Michael K. Vaughan's June on the Range, and I really enjoyed them. Or I only read one Louis L'Amour novel. It was Matagorda. It was okay. I didn't like the ending. L'Amour's endings in his novels tend to be not blunt exactly, but they wrap up very quickly, and sometimes they don't wrap up in a way that makes sense. Or that they don't wrap up in a way that I think they should anyway. So, but this was alright. This was pretty good. I liked it. After that, I read Sarah Bradford's The Reluctant King, The Life and Reign of George VI. And I made something like an 18 or 19 minute review video of this one. I really enjoyed this. I find George's story to be pretty inspirational because he was someone who never planned to be king. He never planned to be in the public eye at all if he could help it. He suffered from a great deal of anxiety, and he suddenly found himself having to fulfill the role of king, and he did so admirably. And I really enjoyed reading this. I'll leave a link to the video I made, but I'll say that Sarah Bradford, I'm not sure how a person who doesn't have a somewhat solid background in reading British history would be able to get into this book, because Bradford expects you to know royal titles. She expects you to know who these figures are from, throughout these 50 or so years. She expects you to know the acronyms and the title, or she expects you to know acronyms and government offices and that kind of thing. I've done quite a bit of reading about I've done quite a bit of reading about Britain in that time period, so I knew most of the figures and the titles and acronyms, but if you're not so familiar with them, this book would probably be a little bit difficult to read. So after that, I read another Louis L'Amour collection, and West from Singapore, and these are all seafaring stories, and they're about Ponga Jim Mayo there. That's Ponga Jim Mayo. And this is an actual scene from one of the stories. So, once upon a time, book covers used to be about actual scenes from the books they covered, believe it or not. And Ponga Jim Mayo is a two-fisted 45 automatic carrying American, and he's always getting in fist fights multiple times through every story. He knows how to use every weapon known to man. He gets clubbed over the head so many times in this one that it's just unbelievable. And really, these stories were pretty unbelievable, and I kept finding myself thinking about Popeye the Sailor Man the whole time I was reading this, because I mean, Ponga Jim Mayo is basically Popeye. You know, I mean, there are differences, but Ponga Jim is always having to fight bigger, muscled up guys like Bluto, and it was just too over the top, really. I think that's kind of an issue with a lot of Lamore's fiction, is that it's so over the top as to be unbelievable. But I still enjoyed it. I still had a good time. I probably won't be reading any more Lamore for quite some time, but for some reason, like I said, I've just been reading so much fiction and nonfiction written by British authors taking place in Britain that I just needed a distinctively American voice for a little while. And Ponga Jim, what's the thing is, though, that Ponga Jim is actually working with the British in the islands in Indonesia and Singapore, New Guinea, that kind of place. So there's a recurring character called, I think he's called Colonel William. And so Jim's always working with the British, so it's kind of funny that in my desire to read about something other than Britain and the British, I read a book about an American guy helping out the British. So, but I still really liked it. It was, you know, it's kind of, a lot of Lamore's figures, they're so much like, they're like superheroes without any real superpowers other than having, you know, thick skulls and big muscles. I don't know. I was thinking also about Ray Bradbury while I was reading this. And there's a quality that both Ray Bradbury and Louis L'Amour have. And it's a little bit hard to explain. It's kind of I couldn't really work it out, to be honest. There is a kind of over-the-top smoothness to their writing that, I don't know, I was just linking it together in my head, and I wish I had been able to work it out better, because it's kind of been bothering me ever since how Louis L'Amour and Ray Bradbury seem to be very similar writers, even though they write about different subjects. So that's something I may have to look into further in the future, and because it's really, I don't know, it's hard to explain it. I haven't been able to explain it even to myself, but those two seem very similar to me, and I'd like to work out why that is. So that's West from Singapore by Louis L'Amour. So the next book I finished was Blood, Toil, Tears and Sweat, The Great Speeches of Winston Churchill. I've been reading this since, I think, August, so it's not something I blazed through, and it was really good. I'm not going to say too much about this because Churchill's speeches are pretty well known. There are some in here that aren't very well known, and I'm really not going to be able to do them justice. My one issue was that speeches are meant to be heard. You know, they're meant to be spoken aloud. and reading them doesn't quite convey the same power that hearing them spoken does. The war speeches are particularly good. There are some that aren't quite as interesting just because they're about events that we're not really all that interested in the present. You know, mostly when it comes to Churchill's speeches, people are going to be interested in the war speeches. And I'll admit, that's what I was mostly interested in. But they were still pretty good. So the next book I read after that was Fortune Favours the Brave, The Battle of the Hook, Korea, 1953, by A.J. Barker, in this really nice New English Library edition. I really like these editions. I don't see these very often, but because they are UK editions. I have another one right here. This is Winston Churchill's The River War, which I haven't read this one yet. They all have these really nice wraparound covers that they're from the 70s. Right? So I don't know much about the Korean War, and I don't think I've ever read a book about the Korean War before this one. I've read books that touch indirectly on it, or kind of, give a really short look at it. So this was sort of new territory for me, except not really. And what I mean by that is that in 1953, at least in this place, the lines of the war had come to kind of a stalemate. And the Hook territory is a little bit hard to explain. I'm not particularly good at imagining geography in my head, or even, there are little maps in here, but it's really difficult for me to keep the maps in my head as I'm reading. But it had kind of developed into a World War I system with the no man's land in between, and the Chinese troops were on one side and the UN forces were on the other side, and they were dug into trenches and into caves and things like that. And they had the whole barbed wire and machine guns and howitzers set up that they had in World War I. And this is about a British battalion that was attacked by Chinese troops over a series of days in attacks very similar to those made in World War I. The Chinese troops would come in on either side of a point and then rush in towards the middle. And it was okay. While I was reading this, I realized that the author was very gung-ho in a very British way. And now, it doesn't tell us anything about A.J. Barker in this, as far as I could find. I didn't see an author bio. But while I was reading it, I was thinking, this guy has got to be not only military, but an officer. He just had that kind of vibe about him as he was writing some of the things that he said. And I looked it up, and he was actually an officer. He joined the military in 1936. He served in Europe, the Middle East, and the Far East. So I don't know if he served in Korea or not. I wasn't really able to find out that much about him, except that he went to the Staff College and to the some kind of science college, some kind of Royal Military Science College. So that's really all I was able to find out about him. So I enjoyed this. I have a hard time keeping geography and strategy in my head, and so it was just an interesting story of this battle. Some of the people who went through it. I'm already starting to kind of forget exactly what happened, starting to forget the particulars, who was where and who was doing what. But I enjoy reading these books. I collect war paperbacks like this, and I've been thinking about doing a tour of my war paperback shelf. I've collected quite a few of them. Um, so that's what I've been reading these last couple of weeks. Love to hear your thoughts. Have you read any of these? Did you like them? Did you dislike them? Just let me know. And what I'm reading right now is Georgette Hare's Envious Casca. And I just really like this cover. Everybody in this book is nasty and rude and spiteful, and it's something else. So maybe I'll talk about that next time. I'm about halfway through with it right now. So thanks for watching. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, and I'll see you next time.